this opening. It is like in Monty Python, and now for something completely different. So I have the pleasure to open the last session, and Victor was prepared to give a sort of special touch to it. The last session is about governance. In fact, we discussed a lot about governance, especially the first session yesterday was already full of governance-relevant issues. MOE is, of course, one example. But also in most of the other presentations, also if you talk about prevention, as we did in the session before, you come always to issues about governance, we have some evidence for effective interventions. We don't have a lot of governance supporting the implementation of best practices based on this evidence, so also there, governance is an important issue. We close with, let's say, 3 presentations on before the closing session, the real final closing, on governance, which was a central issue, not just in area 5, in which I also work, but also in a lot of other areas. And we will start with the well-being issue, let's say the well-being paradigm, you could say. We discussed a lot in this project about finding a way to reframe addiction. Unfortunately, we always stick to addiction, we abandon addiction, and then we talk about addiction. Yeah, it is like this. The interesting thing is, of course, I mean, addiction, drug use was always framed, especially around the start of the 20th century, as a crime. The crime paradigm was prevailing. You got later the health paradigm, or the disease paradigm, if you want. The disease paradigm was very useful to start harm reduction, methadone, etc., to understand addiction. And then, yeah, there were, of course, also a lot of negative effects, stigmatization, etc. But also seeing all forms of drug use as a problem, as a health problem, as disease, also recreational use. So there was the search for a better paradigm, and yeah, Toni will present on this why well-being paradigm is a better paradigm.
Thank you, Franz, and thanks to all of you. Probably if we think about your well-being, you would be better walking around the streets in Barcelona than being here now. But I hope that this will also contribute to your well-being. And I think you framed very well why we're talking about well-being today. In the next minutes, I would like to follow this outline. So what are the shortcomings on the measurement of the impact of drugs in our societies, and why do we need better ways to approach this? I'll try to give some rationale for why we need an ethical approach to this topic, and then I will move into what we think it is well-being, how we can measure it, and which is the way forward we are proposing. Let me start with the shortcomings. We all know that drugs have a tremendous impact in our societies, and there's a big tendency to use GDP as the measure of this impact. And one of the things we are trying to say now is that it does not all end up with the GDP, and that we need to go beyond that. Why is GDP not enough? Well, I would say that it's not comprehensive and it is not ethically valid. It's not comprehensive and it's not ethically valid because it places too much emphasis on the material wealth, and it underestimates very important aspects of the societal impact of drugs. Amongst them, intangible costs. One of the things I think it's very, very important and quite often forgotten, most of the harm to others, and also the damaging effects of inequalities. And that is why we are thinking that in this new, in this project, which is trying to reframe addictions in order to redesign the governance of addictions, well-being can be proposed as a useful indicator. Why are we making the emphasis on the ethical approach? We think it is quite relevant. In fact, we give it enough relevance to have it as one of the chapters on the last book of the 6 OUP books on the series of addiction governance. And we think it's very important because drugs have been approached from a moral perspective. And we think it's time to clearly shift from the moral perspective to the ethical perspective. In short, the moral perspective is a personal code. The ethical perspective implies an analytical methodology. And when we use those concepts in the drugs, in the use of drugs, what we see is that from the moral perspective, we have the old argument that drugs are bad and we aim at a world free of drugs, while from the analytical methodology, we know that drugs are here to stay and that we need policies that minimize the harm produced by drugs and preserve societal well-being at maximum. So it's a very different perspective that you get from this frame. And with this ethical perspective, the decisions taken in public health need to be judged by their consequent outcomes for well-being. This means that policies should maximize the greatest good for the greatest number of citizens. And obviously, when we take this approach, there are at least 2 questions, probably more, but at least 2 questions get raised. When we are restricting access to drugs, are we compromising individual freedom? And I think that the English people have a very nice saying that gives a good answer to this first question. Obviously, we are not compromising the freedom. We are limiting the freedom in order to everybody have right to his own freedom. And the second question is, can we really measure well-being in an objective way? And that's really a question. It's very difficult to measure well-being, and this is one of the difficulties we are facing. How do we understand well-being and how do we measure is the next thing I want to address. Well-being has been linked to QALYs and DALYs, and those are very nice and objective measures, but this misses a very critical dimension of well-being, which are the non-medical experiences of the people. Even though I'm a doctor and I tend to think health is the most important thing in life, but we need to accept and understand that there are many more things beyond health. So when we talk about well-being, it is clear that it exists at least in 2 dimensions, an objective dimension and a subjective dimension, and it's defined as the individual experience of the own life and also how you compare this individual experience with the social norms and values that are around you. Well-being has been defined as a multidimensional concept, even though it can be seen as a single concept in itself or as a composite of various elements, which is how we tend to understand it. And it's obviously very much linked to health in a clear interaction so that well-being impacts on health and health impacts on well-being. And as I said, we have objective and subjective elements in this well-being. When we are using a well-being frame, this helps us to see the policies in a different way. So it allows us to see the collateral effects of those policies, and those may be good, but they may be against the well-being of people and be at the expense of criminalization, social stigma, or social exclusion, up to the point that sometimes those can outweigh the benefits of the policies. And let me give you just one example on social exclusion. This is how people in the UK use cannabis. As you see, white people smoke much more cannabis than the black people. This is the odds of being stopped and searched for drugs. And here you see black people have much more probabilities of being stopped. And if being stopped and found drugs in you, the risk of being charged is again much higher in the black people than in the white people. So enhancing these collateral damages that we were talking about. So when we talk about the well-being frame, we need to think of various dimensions. The simplest way of presenting it is on one dimension on quality of life, one dimension on material conditions, and a third dimension, which I'll come back later, which is the sustainability over time. Drugs and drug-related harms are affected by those dimensions, and they also affect those dimensions. There's been lots of work in the last 20, 25 years on well-being and different frameworks. We tend to use the OECD framework because we think it's the one that allows more consensus. Here you have it for those who are not familiar with it. And here, in a very graphical way, you can see the two main components or elements of the well-being framework, the quality of life and the material conditions. And the third element, which I think is very relevant, we cannot think of real well-being if the policies do not allow the sustainability of this well-being over time. So this is a third dimension that needs to be taken into account. You can see on the right hand the GDP as something which is not matching perfectly the material conditions. And this is because from a well-being perspective, there are parts of the GP, like the regrettables, that are not part of the well-being. So, for example, if I have a car accident and I need to buy a new car, this would be part of the GDP, but it's not certainly for my well-being. This well-being framework allows us to look at the collateral effects of policies, and these can be positive or negative. One example of positive effects, a simple one, would be when someone is quitting smoking, there's some amount of money that increases the household that can be spent in other goods and services. And on the other side, we also have bad side effects of policies. And a classical one is when someone gets into prison for possession of drugs, this has a very negative impact in the well-being of this person, especially if we look at all the items in the quality of life component of well-being. So the well-being helps us to, in a way, reframe this harm-based perspective on the policies on drugs to a well-being perspective, which is just the opposite, reaching to the same conclusions, where we see that we want to maximize well-being, and this is usually away from the two ends of the policy spectrum, the unregulated legal market and the unregulated criminal market, the ultra prohibitions. The interesting thing is that when we want to optimize this well-being and we want to be at the top of the curve over there, we need to understand or to accept that this optimal point of maximum societal well-being depends on the relative value placed on the different components of the well-being. And because of that, this balance will have variations across cultures and across time. So it's something that needs to be monitored on a continuous basis. And let me go to the final part of my presentation, what comes next. I think we still need some work on the internal validity of the well-being construct. My main concern, I do really think that the operationalization of the well-being framework is not a main issue. And I do think that we do have a lot of work in weighting the different components of the well-being frame. So what does this mean for policy? Well, for us, well-being is the new frame that needs to address the new policies, and it helps to think of policies as balancing the criminalization of illicit substances with effective regulation of legal substances, and taking always into account aspects like social exclusion and stigma, which are very relevant. And I'm running out of time. I started saying that your well-being may be better if you go around walking. Let me give you some of the messages from the Mental Capacity and Well-being Project. They suggest that for our well-being, we should be able to connect, be active, take notice, keep learning, and give. And I hope that this is what we've been doing during these whole 2 days, and that this also will contribute to our well-being. So thank you very much. As we say here, moltes gracias.
Thank you very much, Tom, this short overview of a quite complex paradigm, I would say. I think it is also very good what you did, showing where we are still working on, what has still to be solved. So there are good issues for further discussion, and I would like to give the floor now to people who have questions, remarks to Toni before the next speaker. Silvia.
As you are aware, in the work package 5, we did a small exercise of a pilot study under the, in substitution treatment centers with 4 countries, and actually Franz and Jacek and colleagues from Sweden and us were involved. And one of the major issues is that is measuring well-being. There are different perspectives. You can measure well-being in the population level, but when you go into well-being of addicted population in the context of general well-being, we realize that you have to control by the general well-being in the country, because this has a major impact on the levels of well-being that the addicted people can achieve. I give you an example. If you compare Netherlands with Spain in our context, the levels of well-being of the Netherlands in general are higher than the levels of well-being in Spain. And then you never reach similar levels of well-being from your population, because the societal, I don't know if probably I'm not explaining myself, but there are these societal level well-being, and then specifically the well-being on these collectives, risk groups or harm addicted groups it's an issue, and it's difficult to measure this in this context. Well, I'm probably not so clear with my question, but it's one of the major problems we face during the operativization of measuring well-being in the context of addictive population.
Yeah, I think it's very clear that measuring well-being is still very difficult. And obviously in different countries you have different levels, and when you compare within countries, this needs to be taken into account, obviously.
No, Laura.
I was wondering if you could talk about the relationship between well-being and the social psychological concept of hedonic balance. I don't know if you're familiar with that concept, but it's very relevant to drug addiction. It's the idea that there's a certain equilibrium within the self, not too happy, not too, right? That there's a sort of stable equilibrium in terms of emotion, affect. And since I heard about well-being as a result of Alice Rapp, I've been interested in the relationship because I think it's very relevant to addiction.
I'm not familiar with the concept of hedonic balance, but from the well-being perspective, one of the things that is good is that it can incorporate very easily and very smoothly the benefits of using drugs. So in this aspect, I think it's a good frame. I don't know if you were meaning
That's
this
exactly
or something different.
So there was discussion in the meeting about, well, drinking is pleasurable.
Yep.
But too much drinking, it follows a curve for each individual, right?
Yep. And that's exactly what, when you get the well-being approach, you can take all those aspects into account.
Magic.
Well, I'm really proud that medical people go well beyond health perspective and talk about well-being. But I'll make a historical reference to the Alma Ata Declaration of WHO over 50 years ago, when already the concept of well-being was to replace the lack of disease. So perhaps if we talk about the history and roots of this thinking, we should also give this reference. And the third comment is on your curve, when you relate level of control over drugs and well-being, which I like very much, but then you suggested that decriminalization of illicit drug is a policy choice you probably would suggest. But I think we should be more explicit with this regard, because we have option legalization, decriminalization, depenalization, and maintaining prohibition. So perhaps we should be more accurate, more articulated these dilemmas. And I don't know which way is the best way. Probably prohibition and full legalization might bring adverse consequences, but whether we want decriminalization on toleration or whatever Dutch approach, that is something which we need to consider carefully. And final comment is, in the beginning you claimed, and correctly, that the aim of public policy should be to maximize well-being to maximum number of people, but already at that point I would add, and minimize adverse consequences of these policies, because you can maximize to maximum number of people, but small minority may suffer from these policies. So we should be always aware of the fact that not only maximization of well-being to maximum number of people, but preventing that other people, even if they are in minority, suffer from the policy. Thank you.
I fully agree with this view. When you mentioned the previous works of WHO, it reminds me, I mean, introducing new concepts in our societies is, I mean, it's not now like when it took 100 years to have citrix in the ships that were going to the Americas to fight scorbutus, but it takes a long time. For example, we introduced the standard drink in Spain in 1990, and now it's beginning to be standard practice. So it's taken 25 years in a very small country, and I think the well-being concept is moving, and it will not be fully implemented shortly. And I would say that it will not be implemented in the addictions field successfully if it's not implemented, you know, from a wider perspective in the public health arena. You were also mentioning the responses. I think those are two different debates. One is which is the frame, that's the well-being. The other one is which are the policy responses, which I would agree that we, in the slide, we were talking about regulation as usually the approach that usually fits better with a well-being framework.
Any more questions, or do I? would he profit from the post-lunch dip? Okay, then I would like to thank you again, Toni, and I would like to give the floor to Peter. This is about the health footprint, also an issue we have discussed a lot here in ALICE-REP meetings. Comparable in a way to the carbon footprint. It is a measure which allows to inform policymakers, politicians about drug harm, about, let's say, also measures to take against this drug harm. So, Peter, please.
Thank you, Franz. Yes, this has been a concept or an idea that's been evolving and developing throughout the ALICE-REP project. We had a very good pre-meeting where we had our e-lab on looking at issues of future governance, where we talked a lot about the health footprint in detail and also considered how we can kind of take it forward in a more operational or more practical manner. I'm going to start by reminding us, of course, of disability-adjusted life years, the composite measure of years lost due to ill health or premature death. And we're all used to using DALYs in a number of contexts. For example, ranking risk factors or conditions in terms of overall contribution of ill health and premature death. We're used to using DALYs to rank countries, although that is somewhat more contentious. And we're used to using DALYs to assess or rank the impact of different policy approaches from either their impact or cost effectiveness perspectives. And here's just some examples of those. This is the latest data ranking risk factors and conditions for DALYs throughout the world for the year 2013, with high blood pressure at the top, then smoking, then high body mass index, childhood undernutrition, high fasting plasma glucose, and then I'll stop at 6, alcohol use. So we're used to sort of understanding what risk factors, and you can do the same with disorders or conditions, contribute to the global picture of ill health and premature death. We're also, or are somewhat used to ranking countries, and this is just an example in Europe, looking at alcohol attributable DALYs in the age range 15 to 64 years, in terms of European countries, in terms of per capita within those European countries, so that we can sort of see which countries have higher alcohol attributable DALYs per inhabitant. And then we're used to many publications that look at the impact of policy approaches. This is taken, this is using an example of Germany, taken from the OECD report that came out beginning of, I never remember which year I'm in, beginning of last year. And this, for example, is looking at DALYs in blue and life years in grey averted in any one year due to a range of policy measures. Were you able to implement brief interventions for everyone who would benefit from them, down through tax increases, advertising regulations, and so on and so forth. So we're used to looking at DALYs in this way. But I would argue, or we would argue, that maybe this is a missed opportunity because DALYs could also be used to apportion responsibility of DALY contribution by all of the different drivers of harm. We can also use DALYs to apportion responsibility for their production by public and private sectors. So what is the food industry's contribution to ill health? What is the alcohol industry's contribution to ill health? What are government's contribution to ill health? What is the contribution of failed policies to ill health? And thus we can use DALYs as a metric for accountability that may be one way of helping to drive change and reduce harm. If you are indicated what your responsibility is for ill health, maybe that helps push you a little bit to doing something about reducing that harm. And we in ALICE-REP propose calling this additional use or reframing of DALYs a health footprint, and we propose it as a part of a redesign of health governance. And it's very similar in some ways to a carbon footprint, which is a tool for climate change management. Carbon footprint, as you know, is a measure of greenhouse gas emissions produced by actions of an entity. And the central reason, or one central reason for measuring a carbon footprint, is to reduce world temperature increases through apportioning responsibility for emissions across drivers and enabling targeted and effective reductions of emissions of greenhouse gases. And it's possible to identify a whole range of drivers of the carbon footprint. This is from the latest 2014-15 International Panel of Climate Change assessment, looking at a range of different drivers from population size through things like trade, through things like awareness creation, economic incentives, technological developments, and so on. And from that, one can apportion the carbon footprint by sector. And you've got a range of sectors here. At the top, you've got the energy sector as an example, and at the bottom, in green, you've got agriculture, forestries, and land use as a sector. So we can see and plot over time what is the contribution of different sectors in terms of carbon emissions or their carbon footprint. And in the same way, therefore, one would say that a health footprint can be proposed as a measure of risk factor related DALYs produced by the actions of an entity. And that, again, modeled on the carbon footprint, can be a tool for health change management because we're apportioning responsibility of who or what is producing health-related or alcohol-related, addiction-related DALYs, and thus hopefully lead to better health improvement. And again, in the same model, we can map and identify potential drivers of a health footprint, many similar kind of issues around population size and structure, technological development, exposure to products, policies that might reduce exposure, and so on. But what we don't have, like we had for carbon, we don't have something like this available for health. It's not easy to identify which sectors in society are producing ill health, as has been done for carbon. So as a tool for climate change management, we can think of measuring carbon footprints of nations, regions, and cities, of sectors and organizations, of products and services, and even as for individuals. And again, we can do exactly the same with a health footprint. So let's just give some examples of the similarities between these carbon and health footprints at the country level. This is, for Europe, the overall carbon production by the territories in Europe, or the jurisdictions in Europe. I'm just using Germany as an example. I mean, obviously, Germany, with the largest population size, is likely to be a greatest contributor to carbon footprint simply because it's got a lot of people. And that's demonstrated in this slide where Germany is responsible for a little over, can't see it, 21% of carbon emissions in European Union. But not only that, you can look at the carbon production per inhabitant by territory. You can't see all the countries, I'm afraid, easily on this graph, but the red is pointing to Germany. So Germany not only has a high carbon footprint as a jurisdiction within Europe because of its population size, but it actually also has a high carbon footprint per inhabitant. So you can use this information to say that, you know, if Europe as a whole wants to reduce its carbon footprint, were Germany able to reduce its carbon footprint per inhabitant lower down to some of those lower countries, that would provide benefit not only for Germany, but would provide benefit for Europe as a whole. And we can follow the same exact logic or idea with health-related footprints. Here's an example of alcohol. So this is the overall alcohol health footprint per territory in the European Union, calculated in DALYs. And again, using the example of Germany, the biggest contributor, simply, or not simply, but largely, because of course Germany has the largest population size, so inevitably it's going to be one of the biggest contributors for health and alcohol-related health footprint for Europe. But again, if you look at the alcohol health footprint per inhabitant by the territory, Germany actually does slightly better than many other countries, but the point here again is, were Germany able to reduce its alcohol health footprint per inhabitant, you know, all the way down to the best country, Italy, this would lead to a major improvement in health-related DALYs, not only in Germany as a whole, but in the European Union as a whole. What about at a city level? There are there are literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of examples of cities that have calculated their carbon footprint. This is one example of carbon footprint of UK cities, where they also looked at what was driving some of those carbon footprints, or the relationship by household car ownership, so that you could see as per household car ownership went up, so the carbon footprint of all of these UK cities went up. It's very difficult to find equivalent data for anyone who's estimated a carbon health footprint at a municipal or city level. I found one example in the HIV/AIDS field, and I found the other example where someone was trying to, rather than look at the city as a whole, look at the health impacts of the London bicycle sharing system in terms of changes in disability-adjusted life years. Bicycle systems in cities do two things. One is that they do encourage physical activity, therefore that's a health benefit. They do have a downside in some cities that there can be an increase in accidents, and that's obviously a health disbenefit. But as you can see overall, when the London bicycle system was evaluated, it was estimated that there were net benefits due to health, even taking into account an increase in accidents. But as I said, it's almost impossible to find any city that's actually calculated their disability-adjusted life years by a range of risk factors. What about at the sector or the product level? I mean, this is huge. There's actually a huge amount of work, as we know, in the carbon footprint area. I'm just going to give one example because it was interesting that also related to one of our topics, which is alcohol. This was looking at the carbon footprint of pale lager per volume of lager produced by the packing format, and showing that, for example, multi-pack bottles had a higher carbon footprint per volume of alcohol than single small 66 centilitre bottles. So I mean, it just illustrates that, you know, beer producers can change their carbon footprint by their packaging requirements. But you can also calculate what's the health footprint of a global brewer. And this was a little bit of a back of an envelope calculation that Jürgen Rehm, who I think has gone, and I did for one brewer, trying to estimate in relation to its beer production and its the concentration of its beer products and its beer production in different regions of the world, to add up what was its DALI contribution. And this particular beer company, it was estimated in the year 2012 contributed something like 3.4% of all alcohol attributable DALIs. That's interesting because that beer company can then reflect on what does it want to do about it. It could set a target of reducing its health footprint. In its annual reporting, it could present its health footprint, set its target, and say how it's going to try to achieve that change. Individual level, I'll go through this a bit more quickly. There are algorithms to estimate the carbon footprint of individuals. This has been done, for example, very regularly in many different countries. This is comparing part of north of England, Yorkshire, with the UK as a whole, attributing the individual carbon footprint by the different sources of what that individual is doing in terms of their power consumption, their food, their travel, their shopping, and so forth. In fact, there's even evidence that providing feedback to information of the carbon footprints of different products can change purchasing behaviour. This is a US study that looked at the impact of labelling on the changes in the carbon footprint of apple purchases, whether the apples were in season or whether one was out of season of apple production. And it compared the impact of a location label, so saying where the apple came from, how far away it was, with the location and the carbon footprint of that product, and showing that showing that in season that consumers, when they had information about the carbon footprint, were making purchases that were more likely to reduce the carbon footprint. We don't have, again, individual-based health footprint calculations. I just put this up as an example that, we can do it. There are algorithms, for example, in relation to calculating the health contribution of your blood sugar levels and so forth. So it's not too far off to be able, with existing technology, to estimate an individual health footprint. But we don't have this for health. I mean, we don't, for individuals, we're not able to kind of break down an individual's health footprint by the different contributions of risk factors or behaviours and so on. So in conclusion, I would say that whilst we've been quite good at using DALYs to identify risk factors and rank countries and model the potential impact of government policies, we've not really gone to the next step to apportion DALYs across actors and actions as a tool of accountability for public and private sectors, or drive DALYs down to the municipal or individual level as has been done with the carbon footprint. And we call this next step to be done a reframing of DALY as a health footprint, and we propose it as part of a redesign of health governance, and in practical terms would sort of suggest now starting to move forward to do health footprints of producer companies, health footprints of municipalities, to get the idea a little bit accepted and out there in practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Laura, first question, please.
This is really wonderful, Peter. My one concern is in drawing the analogy between the global warming debate and health. There's this problem, which is the neoliberal assumption that our health is up to us. It's an individualized framing. I think in the climate change discussion, and I'm sure you've thought about this, so I want to hear what you think, but in the climate change discussion, I think there's a little bit more of a sense, you know, of a polar bear floating around on an iceberg. There is, it's a more collectivized and globalized way that we think about it. And so I'm wondering, in practical terms, how we might overcome that problematic assumption that my drinking, my exercise, my eating is my problem.
I mean, I hope I haven't implied that, or I hope that was no implication of this, because the health footprint to me just does the complete opposite of that. I mean, what it is saying is that take the example of a producer company. A producer company is producing a product that impacts on my health. They are therefore not my health, collectively society's health, they are therefore accountable for that, so that we're putting accountability back, for example, to a producer company saying your contribution to the health footprint of Europe is X, Y, and Z. You have a responsibility to do something about it. It also puts responsibility on governments and government policies. So when the UK did its U-turn on its minimum unit price, that even in the government's own estimates, was going to lead to thousands of deaths. So the health footprint of that policy change, led by one individual, the Prime Minister, he is accountable for that. So the health footprint, as it were, turns the accountability back to them.
I understand that, but that company can just come right back and say, Peter, control your drinking. It's your problem, not mine.
Okay.
And that's, I think, where I understand that it is an effort to reframe, but there is this assumption that it's very deeply rooted.
But that's not unique to health footprint. That could be unique to every policy that we advocate for. So yeah. that you know, when we call for price increases, which we all do, the company can still come back and say, well, you know, your problem is your problem. I mean, one just has to demonstrate that these are collective problems that need collective solutions. I don't see how the health footprint concept worsens that argument.
No, it doesn't worsen it. I'm just, okay. How do we overcome it?
Okay, thank you.
More questions, Peter? Tamyko?
I complement just to Laura. I think in Europe it's easier because the cost of health, it's collective. And it's your drinking, but we are paying for your health.
Thank you, Tamyko.
Excellent point.
Charles?
Sorry.
Thanks. Charles Perry from South Africa. Just to pick up on something we talked about, would you consider the health footprint to be a negative? Are you going to use that negative valence?
Yeah, this is a problem, isn't it, in the terminology? I mean, health footprint sounds an easy way of describing it, but of course it's an ill health footprint. Someone has to help with coming up with how to title it in a better way.
I mean, it could be a negative health footprint. This action causes a reduction in health, so it's a minus.
Okay, so how do you impute?
Or this
what is your negative
health.
impact on the health footprint, and what is your positive impact in improving it? Yeah.
More questions to Peter? Please. We're getting there? Yeah. Not working.
Just following up on that, I think that is an important point, and I wondered that given that not all the harms are obviously health harms, that there are other harms as well, whether to think of it in terms of a harm footprint. I mean, it's you obviously thought of that. And
yeah, no, we've had that, and in fact, in the discussion in the e-lab that we just had, I mean, one of the ideas is, how do we expand this into quotes a well-being footprint? And I would fully agree. I've argued, let's start at least somewhere and get something going first, and then see how we can develop it and expand it to capture other harms other than just health harms.
Any more questions to Peter? Oh, Victor.
It means that it goes completely beyond the addiction or psychoactive substances field.
Yes. I mean, we sort of pushed this idea to begin with in terms of looking at addictions, but this, if it's going to take off, it should cover health and health risk factors, yes.
Yeah, just go on.
This is very interesting because, I mean, very important outcomes of the psychoactive substance-related project is going beyond, also in terms of not only this one, but also this heavy use over time. We have heard about sugar, which is, I mean, in this direction beyond this psychoactive substances.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Oh, this was just a side remark. So, okay, the last one. Because you played so well.
But then it looks like the field of addiction of psychoactive substances, policy and so on, is a bit getting empty due to the project. Broadening. We are losing the core of the discipline, or how to say that?
Okay, you can. I mean, let's not get into that debate too much. But I mean, I am a generalist by training, so I have two hats. I'm a general practitioner by training as a clinical doctor. I'm what in England we call a specialist in public health medicine by training. And therefore, I look at, I mean, public health is public health. And we, in addictions, we will be deficient if we don't learn also from other public health issues, because the commonalities beyond addictions into other public health issues are enormous. So I'm not in no intention of diluting the importance of all of the addictions, but I would also recognize we have a lot to contribute to other public health matters, as other public health matters have a lot to contribute to our thinking.
Okay.
Here's an example, just one example.
There.
Hi, Peter. I've heard you present this before. I'm not very familiar with DALIs, but I wanted to ask, are there any other aspects of potential harm caused by alcohol, tobacco, gambling and so on, which are not captured in that DALI measure, which could help build or strengthen the kind of footprint idea?
Yeah, I think that's what Robert was getting at. I mean, yes, there are. And I think eventually all of those we need to build in those other factors. But my view is, let's get at least the health footprint conceptualized, developed, calculated, used a bit in this slightly more narrow domain, get the methodology correct. And then when we feel comfortable with that in a more robust way, then we can start adding in and building up other things. I fear that if we sort of try to do the whole picture in one go, we may get lost. That would be my caution about it.
Okay. Thank you very much, Peter. Now we go to the last presentation, Tamyko. We discussed, of course, a lot also about what we can do, different government plans we have. Oh yeah, you have to produce it there, it's more visible. the interesting thing is, of course, we talk also in Europe always about drug policy, and we talk about also convergence of drug policy, and we also see this. I mean, also the EU drug strategy is clearly an instrument reflecting it and supporting it, but still there are major differences between, let's say, drug policies in the countries, and there are very different ways to look at it. We sometimes compare harm reduction, what is done in harm reduction in this country and that country. And Tamyko did a very interesting project to develop a typology to score, let's say, the whole of drug policy, the whole of governance in the country, scoring it on 2 dimensions, on structure and strategy. So, please.
Thank you. It was not only me, it was a whole bunch of people, and most of them are here. My background is in public management and political science, so this will give you a hint of my deviations and the deviations of the study in that sense. We were trying to build a typology of governance of addictions in Europe, and what we did is try to analyze evidence from 28 countries in 4 substances, alcohol, tobacco, cannabis, and heroin. And yes, we are guilty of mixing substances. Yes, we are guilty of mixing different traditional cultures regarding addictions. And yes, we are mixing different GDPs. And we are guilty of all of that because our intention was to try to see if there was a model in Europe regarding how governments are approaching addictions. And the obvious answer is there is no one model. But what we discovered out from this analysis is that we find 4 broad tendencies, 4 broad tendencies, or what we call 4 broad models in Europe, and this is what I wanted to share with you this afternoon, and the reasons behind those models and how come we advise in developing new policies to make those 4 models progress, because none of them is perfect, and we have way forward to get better policies in the future regarding addictions. We had 2 main points of departure, the one that was explained by Toni, the OECD well-frame framework, and a concept that is very much used and abused, the governance concept, and this is the definition that we were using for this study. And we use governance as the processes and structures of mixing government ideas with outside ideas to try to deal with wicked issues, that with the only intervention of government, we are not maximizing the results that we are pursuing. That's why we need governance, to get better ideas, new ideas, different ideas, to try to solve problems and to have outputs to be more satisfied with the final end that we are not now. So this is the model that we were trying to do, we were measuring in each country. So we were developing individual country reports, gathering information from state factors, EU conversion, well-being indicators, sociocultural values, political structure, others, lots of models that were used in the past, but we were also using policy factors regarding addictions, how those countries were approaching addictions, and we defined profiles of countries regarding geopolitics, if they were in the roots of some of the products, consumption indicators, lots of scales of legal and illegal substances and how they rank in the scales, historical paths, if they were aligned with international agreements and conventions or not, and if they were in the guidelines and best practices of the MCDDA or not. And from that we make 2 more differences, how they approach strategy and structure, and this is one of my deviations from public management. These are the 2 main variables that we use to analyze organizations and policies, and both of them are relevant and have an impact in the final outputs. And we did the same for this study. We were analyzing how different countries were organizing, how they approach their structures towards solutions in addictions. So we were using and we were analyzing which was their focus, their priorities, the different ministers in charge, and so on and so forth. This was the structure, and we were also analyzing their strategy, the regulation they were approving, if they were aligned with former regulations they have, or they were changing them constantly, the focus and the priorities. And regarding structure, sorry for the mix before, we were analyzing if they had or not multi-level governance, what were their approach to policy networks, if they have a national structure or they had different structures regarding regional and local governments. And we had that for every country. And at the end, one of the conclusions that we had is that from the analysis of all the countries, we discovered that depending on which issue, you have different solutions, but in the case of addictions, the structure of the approach follows the strategy. So depending on which strategy you define for addictions, different countries are building their organizational structures in ministries and regions and in local governments. We were clustering the countries with all the information that we were able to gather. It was very difficult to have the same information in all the countries. So regarding the availability of information, we chose the indicators, and we came out with 4 clusters. And I'm trying to interpret our conclusions the reverse for you to follow up easier. But these are the 2 main axes that help us explain the final clustering in countries that we have. We have 2 axes, structure and strategy, the ones I mentioned before. And the first one is the vertical axis, the structure one. And in the bottom part, you have those countries that base their structures on substances. So they split policies regarding different substances. They have very centralized structures normally at the level of ministers. Sorry. Normally, they exclude the participation of stakeholders, and multi-level governance, it's highly centralized in central government. In the upper part, you have those countries that approach addictions in a more comprehensive way, and normally they deal with licit and illicit substances together. They involve stakeholders in the decision and in the implementation phases. They have multi-level governance, so they coordinate between different levels of government. Thus, they have very complex structures to be able to coordinate all these actors participating in the implementation of the policies regarding addictions. Then in the horizontal axis on the left, what we have is those countries that focus the strategy regarding addictions on safety and disease approach, criminality and disease approach. So those countries focus more on the individual. Normally it's the Ministry of Interior, Home Office, the one that is dealing with the policy. The policy is focused mostly in criminalizing and drug use. And the main approach is public security approach. So it's more criminalization, security, control, etc. On the right hand, you have the countries that have a more relational approach and a well-being approach. And this translates in focus more on society, not on individuals. Normally, it's the Ministry of Health that is in charge or leading or champion the policies regarding addictions. And for that reason, the main focus is health, it's not security. And most of countries that are in this side focus or are well known for the use of harm reduction approaches and the criminalization of drug use. So this is the kind of axis that help explain the final results we got. And I already told you that we don't have an only model for Europe, but the different clusters, we had a summary of them in 4, and we tried to build labels to understand better how they move. But we have a traditional approach model in this part. Then what we call a transitioning model, because normally those are countries that are moving from here to there or to there, and exceptionally the other way around. That's the case of Denmark. Then we have the model of regulation of legal substances, and finally the trendsetters in illicit substances. We tried to develop the same model for the European Commission and European institutions approach regarding addictions, and we sit them in between model 2 and 1. And I'm trying to explain briefly the 4th model for you to understand a little bit better what I mean. This is the final clustering that we got from this bottom-up approach. The first model, we call it trendsetters in illicit substances. And the countries that you have here, generally speaking, they focus on well-being and relational management. They have comprehensive structures to deal with addictions. They focus mainly in illicit substances, and they deal with harm reduction approaches, but they are very low rankers regarding legal policy scales. So they focus a lot in illicit substances and how to prevent harm, but in other legal substances, they are more easy. Regarding the second model, regulation of legal substances, in this group we have commonalities with the first one because they also have approaches of well-being and relational management and comprehensive structures, but they focus more on legal substances, tobacco and alcohol, basically. But normally those countries don't deal with the criminalization of possession. They try to keep back regarding those more open policies regarding illicit substances. Then we go to the transitioning model. I already told that this is a negative definition because they are moving from the traditional approach to other approaches. But in this model, they still separate substances, as in the traditional model that we are going to see, but they don't decriminalize possession. And finally, in the traditional model, and most of the countries in Europe were coming from this traditional model. Some of them are still there, some of them moved to other models. In those countries, there is an individualistic approach regarding addictions. Safety and treatment of diseases is the basic approach. And the organizational structures of the different ministries and the policies are very based on different substances. So very myriads of organizations trying to perform there better, but very silotic and very focused on security and criminalization. This is the map. And just to simplify some of what I mentioned, of countries that have action plans regarding addictions and how still there are separations of illicit and illicit strategies regarding drugs, and some countries still with no national strategies. But we are seeing also movements towards tendencies in Europe, apart from the 4 clusters, and how they are moving towards an ideal of well-being and a more comprehensive approach of these 3 European trends that come from Trautmann and Franz. We are seeing a decriminalization of drug use as a tendency. We are also seeing a wider introduction of harm reduction policies. We have seen already some controversies, but there is an evolution in this stake, both for legal and illegal substances, and we are seeing a shift from repression to regulation, even regulating new substances to be able for the state to intervene in areas that were illegal or illegal. So one of the questions was, which are the implications for policy? And these are the suggestions coming from the 4 models. I already mentioned that none of them it's perfect. Some of them have advantages, some of them have disadvantages. But if we would like to have a model for Europe where to face or where to aim, this could be the suggestions from our conclusions, both in strategy and structure. More comprehensive strategies combining legal, illegal substances and behaviors. We have seen from former presentations that this is already a need. A whole focus on well-being, more in health and the impact on society and in the harm done, more than in the criminalization or the stigmatization of individuals. Anticipatory and innovative policies based on evidence. Regulative approach, not prohibition approach, but more a regulative approach to be able to access from government to different aspects of addictions and not, again, generating stigmatization and international coordination. It's very easy to put in the slide, you know how difficult this is to get in practice. And regarding the structure, network governance is a must. If we have schools, if we have NGOs, if we have families, if we have patients, if we have security, judges, doctors, we need this network governance at the multi-level governance and with private and public stakeholders. For that, we need to break silos also inside government. We have health department, social and legal department, justice, international treaties, well-being, and they are not talking to each other yet regarding addictions. And we also have to make happen dialogue with local and regional public policies without losing sight of a common strategy, both at the national and at the European level. and we need to avoid the creation of new organizational structures. I don't know if this matches with the creation of an agency for prevention or not. We just leave that on the table. We have two main challenges from my point of view. One is the crisis. The most hit countries in Europe by the crisis are the ones that have made the biggest cuts in those policy areas that are impacted directly regarding the policy of addictions and the different treatments. And the second one is the role of the private sector. I already mentioned that a departure from the governance point of view, and this means dialogue with stakeholders, with family, with NGOs, and also with the industries, but this has to be regulated, transparent, and have checks and balances to be sure that the public sector leadership in the public decision-making is not co-opted by the industry, as we have seen in former presentations. Does this relation have to be clarified in which phase of the policy cycle this dialogue can take part, and which typologies of different stakeholders can be there in those dialogues, and this should be clear if we want to benefit from this governance approach, otherwise the risks are too high. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tamyko. Any questions directly to Tamyko? Alison, please.
Thank you very much. That's, as I've told you before, this is fantastic work. So in terms of next steps, are you thinking about looking at analysing the degree of association between prevalence of use, prevalence of harms, and the different models?
This is one of my deficits, and I would like to mix with other people in this area, which we have lots of experts, because I'm the Martian in this area, but I'd
be very happy to work on it with you.
There are lots of parts of my analysis or our analysis that could be nicely complemented with evidence from data from all of you.
Peter.
Thank you. I'm going to say something very dangerous now. So I'm just warning everyone before I say it. It's a pity that Virginia Berridge left. She reminded us in a paper in The Lancet about a year ago that if you went back to the 1970s, governments and the tobacco industry actually worked together to try to produce safer cigarettes. And then we've gone, of course, on a huge victimization of the tobacco industry, and rightly so because of their behavior. But of course, that industry is no different from any other industry. You could go to Big Pharma, the pharmaceutical industry, that lie and distort data just as much. You can go to Volkswagen, that lie and distort data just as much. My question really is that, I mean, we do have e-cigarettes coming on the market. Without doubt, the tobacco industry are going to be a major producer of those e-cigarettes. Are we ever going to be in a position where dialogue has to take place in an opportunity of a win-win situation, or are we talking about something so dangerous that we can't even go down that road?
Robin.
I mean, this is also, in a way, a follow-up to that, in a way. The problem with the EU structures that, and in general with international structures, is that they work on a system of everyone having a veto who's at the table. So if the industry gets to the table, it gets a veto. And that's what happened in the Alcohol Forum, that's what happens, of the EU and so forth. So in other words, if you're going to make it work in terms of cooperating with the industry, then you have to have a very clear understanding somewhere that there's no veto on the public health interest, so to speak. And that's what, so far, the EU has failed to do anything about. And it doesn't, I don't know, do you agree with me? Do you think that this is the issue?
I work in a business school, so I understand well businesses, and I understand well some of the dangers that were shown in former presentations. I completely agree with your point, but I also would like to add to that that we need experts in our decision-making process in policymaking. And sometimes we don't have the same levels of expertise or seniority in the multi-stakeholder tables. We have the CEO of a multinational, and then we have the third or fourth level of public administration entering a dialogue. And this is what we cannot allow it to happen, because co-option will be there for sure. And if we don't understand that, it's better not to use this networking system, use hierarchy, and then that's all. But if you want to enter in this new system, you have to get expertise, maturity, and seniority.
A very good point, indeed. More questions directly to Tamyko. Because, I mean, there are so many interesting questions following to what Peter just brought up.
Yeah, I want to be shot down.
Yeah.
Everybody is completely flabbergasted and silent.
we can mix the three now, no?
Ah, luckily, you save us.
Yeah, while Anne's thinking. I think the thing is that with any of these commercial organizations, like any individual, do you think people don't know who I am? Do you know who I am? Anyway, oh, I see, so for the for camera. So with any commercial organization, as with any individual, we have to assume that they're going to act to their incentives, whatever those incentives are. And if it were possible for governments to create an incentive structure for the tobacco industry to get out of tobacco and give them an out, as it were, by allowing them to get into something else that would allow them to continue to make billions of dollars and pounds, then maybe there would be a case. However, I don't think we're anywhere close to that at the moment. I think the incentive structure is so strongly, remember this is a global market, in favour of them wanting to produce tobacco, that we have to assume that whatever their interest in a non-tobacco nicotine product, it's going to be either to grow the nicotine market, to mitigate the loss of the nicotine market by encouraging people who have stopped smoking to continue to use a nicotine product of some sort, or, and I believe there's evidence for this, to shape the market so that the nicotine products that they've got keep people smoking. And so the problem then for governance and for regulation is, how do you address that while trying to do something about what is potentially a useful technology? And unfortunately, some of us believe, and I believe, that the European directive is probably going to be counterproductive in that regard, because the regulations that it puts in place for the electronic cigarette market are quite onerous for small companies and not that difficult for large companies to meet. What that means is that it's going to be quite difficult for independent producers to continue to stay in the marketplace, whereas the tobacco industry will have no problem at all meeting those requirements. So it's a very complicated area, but I don't think we're anywhere close to a time when we could have any kind of reasonable dialogue with the industry. That's my view.
Okay, don't get too vivid, it is really shocking. What you did, in fact, you were opening the next stage of this session, because we are already in the debate, so I also would like to ask Toni and Peter, I have been asked that you have to queue there for the visibility for the camera, so you're not allowed to sit here, dark background. We start with Lydia, then we had
Anne, we got Anne as well.
first, sorry?
Anne is waiting here.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
That was a comment to Tamyko. I was involved in all the process, and can you explain a little bit the difficulties we face with the accountability issue of the? We was very difficult. I mean, we used the strategies, but that countries publish, but we were not able to follow or at least track a lot about accountability, and this is something we need to address also.
Regarding Public policies evaluation. We always have the same problem. We have money for the policy implementation, but there is no money for evaluation. And the problem we have with school programs, we have the same problem all around public administration. So what we analyze in this book is what countries say they are going to do and how they evaluate what they did in former programs, because normally when they approve a national plan, they evaluate the former ones. So this is what we reflect here. We were not able to contrast the reality because there were not independent reports regarding the performance of what was promised in the national plan. The only evaluation we have is the poor evaluation, or if there was one, of the country doing the evaluation, more motivating why they are changing the new plan regarding the former one as a motivation more than a real evaluation of what happened to the former one.
Yeah, so Peter challenged me to respond, and I'm just really going to endorse what Robert has said. I think it's incredibly difficult and incredibly complex, and I'd share your concerns that the regulations are probably favouring the tobacco industry at the moment in the electronic cigarette market. But I do believe that the tobacco industry isn't homogenous, and I think there are parts within the industry which would strongly favour a harm reduction approach. And the problem at the moment is by not engaging with them at all, we're not supporting that arm of their business. So I would like to think that you've opened an interesting debate, Peter. It's probably a good one not to have on camera, but I think it is worth exploring to see if there's any possibility at all of trying to do something where you can get some sort of a win-win situation.
I'll just respond with one comment. I mean, the only reason I raise this is to try and think imaginatively and creatively. I mean, despite the Framework Convention, which everyone says is so wonderful, the number of smokers in this world goes up and up, and will continue to go up and up. The number of deaths, and we're what, 10 years now into the Framework Convention, and the number of deaths is going to go up and up. And Public Health England has given a solution to help a lot of those people stop dying, but that will only work according to that logic. If people switch from smoked cigarettes to electronic cigarettes, and there needs to be a mechanism to do that. So that this is, I think, I would argue that, in public health terms, in framework convention terms, in international treaty terms, we're always 10 years out of date, and, we're behind the issue, whereas we should be leading the issue.
So, I have the floor. I'm going to call Peter's suggestion a modest proposal because he's from England and SWIFT and all of that. Could the panel talk about, and I haven't read the book, I'm interested in, it came across in the presentation as a somewhat Eurocentric kind of analysis within Europe. But of course, Europe is nested within global governance, institutions of global governance, and I'm not just talking about drug treaties. I'm interested in the WTO and the international courts and all of the places that industry can and will go the minute anything happens in Europe and a discussion gets opened and so forth. So could we talk about the modest proposal in light of global governance, institutions of global governance? And this is ultimately where the rubber meets the road.
Who wants?
I can't answer that. The problem again is that many of these big institutions just do not protect people's health. The classic example is minimum unit price for alcohol. We have a jurisdiction, Scotland, who, one thing that Scotland can do to save people's lives is to introduce a minimum unit price of alcohol. Yet it goes to a European court who basically says, well, no, you've got to do something else and blah, blah, blah. So that, again, we're stuck with trade, and this is not necessarily even pressure of economic operators. This is just, people with a philosophy of free trade always giving precedence over to trade over people's lives. Yeah, sure.
Franklin was the next one. Then Alison, no? Then after this, Robin. Oh, now you have two. You can do it in stereo.
Yeah, no, I. Okay, I have to stand up for this camera. Well, I wanted to speak to Peter though. I mean, we spent a lot of time, and pretty much all my career in public health, and trying to help people understand that tobacco was a different industry than any other industry. All right. And I don't think, it's surprising for me to hear you say that, oh, it's like, you know, all these other industries lie and cheat, you know, and it's no different than all these other industries. But most of the other industries their products don't kill 1 in 2 people that use them over years, except for the arms industry, which kills everybody that uses them.
And Volkswagen. Volkswagen, the diesels.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly, but it's not 1 in 2. I mean, you know, there was something, we spent a lot of time, and in terms of science and obfuscating issues and influencing governments continuing to do so, I mean, it's basically, you know, I pretty much spent my career thinking of the tobacco industry as the enemy, right? And to sort of say, let's get into bed with the enemy because they have the capacity to make a harm reduction product for their product, sounds meshuggah to me, as my mother would say. You know, and fairly dangerous. You know, it would be, I think that, you know, why do we need the tobacco industry to do that? I mean, when they're you know, if they agree to stop producing all tobacco, stop marketing it, stop spreading it around the world, introducing it to new markets and stuff like that, yeah, then I think we have a basis for starting to talk, all right? But I think we have to get a certain agreement before we even start thinking about getting into bed with them.
Okay, thank you. Robin, please.
Yeah, I would really like to argue against that. And what I'm arguing is that fundamentally, let's take a look at the substances and where the harm is, you know. And, you know, if we're talking here about psychoactive substances, and then, yeah, okay. If we're talking about psychoactive substances, and then we're talking about gambling, which has, you know, some of the same problems of habit formation and so forth. There are really differences between the substances, and one of the crucial differences is that with respect to nicotine, that's not where the harm is, you know, by and large, essentially. So that we've already created the situation, or someone has created the situation which Robert was calling for, which is that we've created a situation which provides an incentive for the cigarette companies to get out of the cigarette business and into the nicotine business, essentially. And it seems to me crazy for public health people to be trying to oppose that in some way or another. If I, you know, just to put it, not to find a point on it, there's much more problem with the alcohol industry. What are you going to do about the alcohol industry in the sense that the harm comes from exactly what is the psychoactive substance, essentially? You can argue, as now, you know, South African breweries or whatever they're called now are arguing that, okay, well, we'll try and sell something that's 20% less alcohol in it. Good luck. They're not, that's, you know, I mean, they've tried that in Australia. And then basically low alcohol Swan Special Light has no part of the market left at all, essentially. It had a bit of the market for a while. So it seems to me that, you know, we need to sort of liberate ourselves from the last 30 or 50 years worth of history and think in terms of what are the sort of inherent properties of the different substances we're talking about. When we're talking about cannabis and, you know, about THC, exactly, you know, the big surprise of the legalization in, as far as I can tell, in Colorado and Washington state so far is that it turns out that when you sell it legally, about a quarter of it is things that you eat, edibles, you know, which have lots of sugar in and have that problem attached to them. And also the fact that, you know, 3-year-olds are much more likely to pick them up out of the fridge than if, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So again, we need to be thinking about the form in which the psychoactive substance is sold and how can we create the market in a way that sends it toward the least harmful form if we're going to have it be legal, as I suspect even in Europe. Cannabis will be within the next 20 years.
The problem is you can put a lot of different drugs in an e-cigarette.
Okay. You would like to respond to it? No?
Put a lot of drugs in an e-cigarette.
All right, so then you start controlling that. You know,
Okay.
I mean, in other words, the thing is, if I think that the way that we're heading at the moment in both the UK and well, in the US at least, with respect to cannabis, is just crazy. You know, it's got no public health, very limited public health restrictions. All that it has in the way of public health restrictions is what the Attorney General of the US could think of.
We come close to this point that I would have to call order, like in the English Parliament. So please.
I mean, just to return to Franklin's point that the tobacco industry, is more immoral than any other industry and had to be treated differently. Well, I mentioned I've extended my interest in vice, and although the endpoints of the policy objectives in tobacco, alcohol, gambling, etc., may be different, the one thing that strikes me is the industries all operate in the same way and can't be separated. I think the utilitarian argument against, collaborating with the enemy, so to speak, I think is shown by alcohol, because we have the pub trade very keen to collaborate with us on minimum unit price, because minimum unit price is bad for pubs, but good for the producers. But when we then want to talk about drink driving, the pubs are very much against lowering the drink driving limit because it's bad for them, but it may be good for others. And once you've made a liaison, a collaboration, a combined strategy with one sector of industry, it's very hard to row back from that when they want to collaborate with you the next time.
Alison, please.
I just want to make a very small point, which is about the illicit drugs and industry. And for me, whenever the debate happens about industry, I think about having the drug dealers in the room when I'm negotiating policy. I think about the outlaw motorcycle gangs. I think about the mafia. I think about all the other criminal networks and all of the other products that they trade in, guns, people, terrorism, and so on. And if we're serious about engaging industry, then it's an interesting thought experiment to think about the illicit industries and how we would engage with them.
You? Well, we are close. Just one remark from my side, because we were in the process of, at least one political party in the Netherlands is in the process of preparing a new law on cannabis regulation and and they invited different experts, so people like me, but also lawyers, but also 2 coffee shop owners. And in fact, I never thought about it, because we were simply sitting there in a round and discussing. I never thought about it. And it was also, they had very good, I have to say, they had very good input. And there are, of course, not yet a full-blown lobby. This is, of course, the interesting thing. You see, by regulation of cannabis, by moving from prohibition to regulation, you see that they start to form interest groups, which in the end, definitely, will be a sort of lobby. But it is in the process of. And it's a very good point what you make, because at a certain point, then we will also discuss with growers, etc. And then you come again one step further, and it's tricky business. Yes. We are close to an end. I would like to give all 3 of you shortly the opportunity to give your view on this complex process. Peter, I can't imagine that you're silent. I can't.
I would like to say that just listening the debate now, I was thinking that was perfect, so that we could be one step behind.
Oh, this was short. Okay, then thank you very much. I liked very much the ending. It was a thank you for your contribution.